The novelist Stephen King once said, "If we give drivers license and we register cars, why not impose the same responsibility on gun owners?" I tend to agree with his sentiment. According to preventive medicine, 85% of gun owners said that there should be background checks for every individual seeking to buy a gun, regardless of who wants to sell the weapon or where the transaction takes place. That's 2 percentage points higher than for gun owners who were asked the exact same question. Because I tend to agree with these sentiments, I propose that the United States federal government increase their background checks to incorporate private sales and private transactions of guns, as well as better their responsibility and cooperation with local law enforcement and national law enforcement organizations to better background checks for potential gun owners. I will establish my case through two main points. The first being the problems that exist in the status quo today and why the federal government is lacking, and the second being how the federal government can better the situation and empirical evidence that proves that expanding these checks can actually reduce gun violence and the suicide rate in the country. But first, let me address the problem of the status quo. According to Johns Hopkins News, currently under federal law, all licensed firearm dealers must do background checks on anyone seeking to buy a gun, but if a person buys a firearm through a private seller, either online, through a classified ad, or at a gun show, depending on where they live, there's a good chance that they won't be subject to a check. Only 6 states require a background check for any purchase of a gun, regardless of the manner of sale. Well, this is troubling. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, also known as the Brady Bill, was enacted November 30th, 1993, as an act of the United States Congress. It mandated that there be a federal background check on firearm purchases in the United States. But as I just said, that background check only applies to federal transactions and not to private transactions. That's an issue. And the lack of responsibility and cooperation that the United States federal government has with the local law enforcement is troubling. Just last week, we had to hear the news of a Texas shooting that claimed 26 lives. This could have actually been prevented. The reason it could have been prevented was had the Air Force, a government branch of the United States federal government, given the criminal background checks over to local law enforcement, then he would have never been able to purchase a gun in the first place. According to USA Today, the Air Force's failure to transmit the criminal background check of the Texas shooter, Devin Kelly, to the FBI, which would have likely stopped the sale of a rifle used in the massacre, highlights a long-standing problem with the systems the U.S. government uses to restrict firearm sales and track gun ownership. One other thing recent shootings says is that the current background check system has some gaping holes in it. For example, the former FBI director James Comey said in July 2015 that Dylan Roof, who killed 9 at a South Carolina church last year, should not have passed a background check because the information about his admission to narcotics charge never reached an FBI examiner handling his check. This just poses the same problem with the shooting last week, that the federal government and local law enforcement are not on the same page in supplying the background checks that are needed to ensure that guns end up in the hands of the right people and not the hands of the wrong people. In addition, some states are doing a poor job of submitting the mental health records to an NICS, as Politico's Kevin Trillis writes, allowing some sick people to obtain guns. Trilli points specifically to the Virginia Tech shooter who had a history of mental illness before he killed 32 people in 2007. Having given the information, he may not have obtained a weapon, and that massacre could have been prevented altogether. According to NPR, using the 2004 data, around 18% of gun transactions involve private sellers, buyers' families, or friends or other sources. As the Washington Post's Glenn Kessler found out that last year a majority of those sources were not licensed dealers and therefore were not required to conduct a background check. So coupling these two things together shows that the federal government's lack of oversight and responsibility and the lack of background checks involved in private transactions can lead to massacres that we saw last week in 2007 and the Emmanuel Baptist Church massacre that happened with Dylan Roof. So when you couple these together, the information provides that these things could actually be prevented. Overall, there were more than 38,000 gun deaths last year, according to the Center of Disease Control, which was up from 36,000 in 2015 and around 33,500 each year between 2011 and 2014. In the past 2 years, the homicide increases in Chicago and other places that have been large enough to elevate the national assistance. According to the FBI's raw numbers, the tally of U.S. homicides involving guns rose to nearly 11,000 last year from about 9,600 the year before, and the overall spike in gun deaths actually occur from suicide, which begs the question, if a private background check did exist and people were not allowed to just go and buy guns without a check, having that mental health background check in place may prevent the suicide rate as well. But that leads me into my transition, which is that of the proposal and how this can be deterred. According to ABC News, the overall firearm death rate rose to 12 deaths per 100,000 people last year, which was up from 11 in 2015. The report that was released by the Center for Disease Control, as I previously stated, that the rate hovered just above 10 and a level had fallen since the late 1990s. The problem with this is that have we used the background check, the mental health background check, this is something that we can use to prevent the suicide rate. And the reason I say that is there's 2 recent studies providing evidence that background checks can significantly curb gun violence. In one, researchers found that a 1995 Connecticut law requiring gun buyers to get permits, which themselves required background checks, was associated with a 40% decline in gun homicides and a 15% drop in suicides. This is significant. The evidence directly correlates that the federal background check and the local law enforcement coupling responsibility relationship with the government actually prevented double-digit gun violence rates and double-digit suicide rates in their community in just Connecticut alone. And that means that there's a direct correlation between these background checks and the gun violence and suicide rates. Similarly, the other study tells us that when researchers studied Missouri's 2000 repeal of the same law that Connecticut mandated in 1995, they found an associated increase in gun homicides by 23%, as well as a 16% increase in suicides. So these studies are very telling. In one, where the federal background checks were actually increased and the relationship was bettered with the local law enforcement and the national government, double-digit homicides and double-digit suicide rates actually decreased. Whereas when you look at the Missouri 2007 study, the lack thereof actually increased double digits in gun violence and increased double digits in the suicide rate. That tells us there is a direct correlation between the two. And according to PolitiFact, background checks have been unequivocally shown to reduce gun violence. Researchers have shown that background checks were associated with reduced gun violence, and they're believed to be a necessary measure to stop guns from falling into the wrong hands. It has not been scientifically proven that background checks alone could reduce gun violence. However, that would be coupled with a separate, broader system of laws, regulations, and enforcement. But the Connecticut study and the Missouri study show us that there actually is a correlation in at least dropping gun violence some percentage, not in whole, but some. And these percentages logically could have prevented the massacre last week, for instance, had the federal government better their cooperation with local law enforcement, and in Virginia Tech had mental health backgrounds in Virginia been established, then the shooter may have never obtained a weapon. So in conclusion, the current system is broken, and there is heated debate on the gun background check argument right now in Congress and in everyday homes, but the studies in the statistics show us that if the federal background checks were increased to private gun ownership transactions, and we avoid gun loopholes, the gun show loopholes, the private transaction loopholes, the classified ad loopholes, that it would actually reduce gun violence and it would reduce the suicide rate. And these are empirical studies that show in Missouri and both Connecticut. The shooting last week tells us that if the federal government better cooperates with local law enforcement, then these tragedies could be better prevented because the shooter would have never been able to obtain a rifle in the first place because of the domestic battery violence that he committed against his family, which disqualified him from obtaining a gun to begin with. So using both these measures logically, even if it would prevent one death, it seems to be something that's worthwhile and worth exploring, and a proposal that the United States federal government should actually implement in policy today. And as preventive medicine said, as I started off the speech with, 85% of gun owners said there should be background checks for every single transaction, which is even higher than people that don't own guns believe.